Well, hi, folks. My name is Ben Krywosz, Artistic Director of Nautilus Music Theater. This is Jill Daw, who is a music director that we've collaborated off and on over the last,
Many years.
Many years. And she is serving as music director for our upcoming Composer Libretto Studio. So today I'm here to talk about musical storytelling and to kind of expand the thinking around musical storytelling. The agenda here is pretty straightforward, just kind of three chunks of stuff. I'm talking about some of the larger issues around musical storytelling and what that means and how that has been evolving in America in the last 100 years or so. I'll talk a little bit about collaboration that has some of the ideas that have grown out of the Composer Libretto Studio that Jill and I and other music directors I've worked with have developed. And then last, we'll talk a little bit about the Composer Libretto Studio. We're not here this is not a recruitment program per se, but since it's coming up in November, we wanted to share a little bit of information. And there's cards and stuff out there on the table and on the wall there. So just to get a better sense of who you all are, just a couple questions. How many here are writers? Okay.
Ooh.
How many here are composers? Okay. And how many here are performers? Great. Okay. And curious to know how many people, this may sound like a really silly question, but I think it's worth asking. How many have been to a traditional European opera? And how many have been to Broadway musicals? Okay. And how many have been to what you might think of as alternative music theater? Okay. And that you can define that however you want. So one of the things that's been happening in American musical storytelling has been a couple things. One is a blending of some of the genres that have been happening over the last 100 years or so, as I mentioned. Another is the sense of something is emerging, something uniquely American, and that's been interesting to see. Another is a focus on performers and what performers are actually capable of doing on the musical theater stage, whether it's opera, musicals, or alternative work. And in Nautilus, we try to take a look at those developments and those tendencies that have been happening, and creating works that are kind of hard to classify. And this comes up oftentimes when people who have not had a lot of experience in musical storytelling, oftentimes the question that they ask is Sweeney Todd an opera? And for many of us working in the field, that's just the most boring question ever. The question really should be, is it a good show? Does it speak to people? How does it work? Things of that sort. A lot of times people have preconceptions about these forms, and we're going to take a look at some of that now. I'm curious to know, maybe Jill, you can help out with this.
Yep.
And I'll write on the board here just some questions, maybe split up and read from the board. Okay. I'd like you to think about what are some of the ideas that you have about what people think of when they talk about opera. So just put that up there.
Wait, what we think other people think?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, when somebody says, I like or I dislike opera because, and what are some of the things that you think might come up?
People hate the recitative.
People hate recitative, okay. By recitative, can you explain that for those that maybe?
Where they're singing through the whole thing and then, I've got to go to the store today, and what do you, not the aria, all that stuff in between, the exposition.
One of the challenges with American opera, which I consider to be an oxymoron actually, I think European opera is redundant and American opera is an oxymoron. But then you talk about prose librettos, which is the whole situation that we'll get into. Other thoughts about what you think people think of as opera?
The style of singing.
And what about the style of singing?
The specific techniques that the singers are using and the specific quality of the sound they're producing
Right.
being different than other styles
Uh-huh.
of music.
And somebody might think about that in a positive way or a negative way?
I was thinking, could be off-putting to some people.
Uh-huh, okay. Off-putting vocalism? Yeah.
And so with the singing, like, sorry, just
Okay, that's what we'll come back to. Yeah.
I'm thinking a lot about accessibility.
The what?
Accessibility of who has access to theaters that produce opera. For many community theaters, the most they might get is an opera like Gilbert and Sullivan.
Uh-huh.
Especially for people outside of major metropolitan areas. There is not consistent places that are producing opera that are like opera houses in large cities.
So you think most people would think that the opera is not very accessible in our community? Okay.
The language it was written in versus the language it's performed
Okay.
in.
So I don't like opera because it's not in my language.
Which could also be an accessibility.
Piece, yeah.
Yeah, that'd be the way to do that. Yeah, you
I was
can
gonna
try to
say
get back.
the singing is favored over the acting.
It's what?
Singing is favored over the acting.
Singing is favored over acting. Okay. Yeah, Josh.
Really big production values.
Yep.
Like, huge budget, really
Right.
big production.
Big production values.
Yeah.
Other thoughts?
The tickets are expensive.
What's that?
Tickets are expensive.
Tickets are expensive. Yeah, Broadway's cheap. But, yeah.
Maybe an air of pageantry about it. You know, like
I'm sorry, what's that?
maybe an air of pageantry about
An
opera.
air of pageantry.
You
Okay.
dress up in your finest clothes to go to the opera house, which is this gilded old building that was ran by the wealthiest person in your town.
Right. So the ritual of going to a high-class cultural event.
Gloves, the
Okay.
opera glasses.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah.
There's frequently not the most compelling story.
So the stories are not compelling.
Where they can feel outdated.
Outdated.
Like thinking of like the Mikado, for example, that just doesn't really feel, I mean, accessible.
Sure.
Today, it just feels dated sometimes.
So outdated dramaturgy?
I should have written smaller.
That's all right.
They
Yes,
can
back
be,
there.
They can be super long. That
Super
can be
long.
intimidating for a casual theater goer.
Yeah. Too long for the casual theater goer. Anything else?
Trying to think of like what might link it to like the symphony or the ballet where people say snooze, like I won't be able to stay awake through all of that. It's maybe not gripping or it doesn't speak to me personally.
Okay. Boring.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think a lot about like age demographic that we assume inherently like people going through opera are going to be much older patrons.
Yeah.
As opposed to like opera for young audiences, opera targeted at a younger generation.
Yeah, yeah. So the older audiences. My first opera was the Wagner Ring Cycle, which is about 19 hours long, spread out over 4 nights. This was in 1972, and I just found out about it. And I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. I haven't done a little bit of study. Oh, and the San Francisco Opera is doing it this season. Well, I'll just call and get tickets because who goes to the opera nowadays, right? And I called and I said, I want a ticket to the Ring Cycle. And the guy laughed. And I said, what's so funny? He said, we've been sold out for 2 years.
2 years.
Oh, somebody's going to the opera. Anything else? Okay, so you guys can, well, I don't know if you can read it because of the glare. Okay, things come to mind. Rest is a T, no good. Story's outdated. Singing style is off-putting. Too long, boring. Accessibility not great. Assume older patrons. Opera can be in foreign language. Singing over acting. Large production values. Sense of pageantry. How many of these elements do you hold yourself about opera? Do some of these things resonate like, yeah, that's probably true? Okay. Some head nods? Okay. Great. So hold those in your mind and go and erase it. We're going to do a similar exercise now for what we think of as American Broadway musical theater. Whatever that means to you. What are some of the ideas that you think other people hold about that art form?
It's not realistic that people would just burst into song.
Okay. Not realistic, as opposed to opera. Other thoughts?
Americans love their musicals.
Americans love their musicals. thoughts?
Disney.
What's that?
Disney.
I'm sorry, that's still
Disney.
Disney, okay. Other thoughts about musicals? All singing, all dancing, all acting, dancing. Musical theater. Yeah.
I think possibly the same, like pageantry, big production
Pageantry.
values.
Everything's a mega musical.
What's that?
People might think that everything's a mega musical.
Everything's a mega musical.
This big.
That's what, yeah. We're talking Cats, Phantom of the Opera,
It is.
Miss Saigon, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
I'd say similarly to opera, there can be an attitude of like, oh, this is a specific kind of singing that I don't always enjoy listening to.
So also the vocal style can be off-putting. Yeah.
And it's similar to opera. For some people, like, going to a musical is a very specific event where we are going to dress up, we're going to have a meal
Sure.
before,
Yeah.
and we're only able to do it once or twice a year because of kind of the ritual that goes around it. It can only
Sure.
be a special event.
Mm-hmm. And the cost can get, there's something very exciting still for me, 73 years old, and when I do go, I very rarely go, but when I go to a Broadway musical on Broadway, and the lights dim and the orchestra picks up, I kind of go, oh yeah, we're going on a ride here. So there is that sense of ritual, the sense of pageantry, yeah. Other thoughts?
And
Yeah.
there's sort of a formula that you can expect. There's sort of a formula you can expect of the production. There's the overture, there's the 12 o'clock number, intermission. You can expect, some big production numbers with a lot of dancing
Sure.
and some more ballad type numbers.
So conventions, structural conventions to be expected,
Yeah.
okay? Yeah.
It seems like there has been a sort of zeitgeistiness of the average patron to be like, well, I don't really like musicals, but I'll go see Hamilton, because that's kind of like
That's the latest
the
thing.
thing right
Yeah.
now. Or like,
Yeah.
in the 90s, I don't really like musicals, but I'll go see Rent, because
Right.
that's the
Everybody's talking about it, I
interesting thing
should go see it,
right now.
yeah. So a sense of fad. Yeah.
I think there might be an expectation of non-naturalism, like the fact that people are expecting a musical to have acting that is broader, and because there are songs, there won't be naturalistic, grounded acting inside the musical,
Mhm.
which I believe to not be, I know to not be true, but I think a lot of people think that.
So a non-naturalistic, or is that really
Yeah.
non-naturalism?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I also think in this moment of musical theater, we're seeing kind of an oversaturation of jukebox musicals or adaptations of
Sure.
movies right now that sometimes musicals right now are not original works.
Or not what?
Original works.
Original work,
That
okay.
it's a
Yeah, so there's a lot of revivals of older musicals, plus what you call jukebox musicals. It used to be that we got our popular music from the Broadway musical. Now we get our Broadway musicals from popular music, you know? So, other thoughts?
Maybe a thinking like, well, musicals are fun popcorn, not real theater.
Where it's not high art.
Right. So musicals are populist and
Fluffy.
and not particularly sophisticated.
Yeah, even cheesy.
Yeah, cheesy.
For
Okay.
certain.
I was waiting for that word to come up.
Yeah.
Okay.
I wonder if some people might share the expectation of like this story that I'm going to see because it's based off of existing IP, that it's a movie that I've known or a book that I've read, that it's going to follow like I suppose like an Aristotelian style of drama, plot structure wise.
Right. So conventional dramaturgy
Yeah.
in terms of its structure.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else? Okay, so looking at this list, we've got non-naturalistic and non-realistic people.
Burst into song.
People burst into song.
Yeah.
Americans love musicals, Disney, pageantry, mega big production values, specific vocal style, special sex.
Expensive.
Oh, sorry.
Sexy.
I'm a little. Okay, expensive.
It was a dollar sign.
I didn't see that. Sense of event and
Ritual.
ritual, yeah. Formulaic structural conventions, the sense of a fad or whatever's happening in the moment. Revivals, jukebox, musicals are cheesy and not real art.
And then the one about dramaturgy, which I
That
don't
goes
know.
back up to that to a certain extent, yeah, especially for adaptations, which I'll talk a little bit about later, about adaptations, that there would be an expectation that's going to follow a story that we know that is generally conventional in its structure. Okay, great. So take a snapshot of that in your mind. And moving on to moving on to what we can think of as alternative music theater. It's a tough term. Sometimes people think of it as the avant-garde, which may or may not be accurate. Performance art may or may not be accurate. But what you might think of as something that deviates from the mainstream in terms of musical storytelling. Some of you have had experience with that, I know, based on you raising your hands earlier. If you're talking to somebody about it or somebody's talking to you about it, what would you expect them to think about that particular genre of musical storytelling? Yeah?
Dissonant music?
Dissonant music. Other thoughts?
Perhaps intimate.
What's that?
Perhaps more intimate.
More intimate, okay. Yeah.
Storytelling on the fringe?
Storytelling on the fringe of the mainstream?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
More naturalistic acting styles.
More naturalistic acting styles, okay. Yeah.
Kind of that difference between a musical and a play with music. I'm thinking a lot about like Brecht, like something like Mother Courage. We don't think of as a musical, but has inherently like musical elements.
Sure. So music becomes part of a number of elements, not the sole thing.
And the
Okay.
way that music is played, whether it's like story theater and there's instruments on stage that you watch a character play versus like the pit, the orchestra. It's underneath the stage or it's up in the loft and you see them all together and you know that they're going to provide the music for the show.
Sure. So you're talking about the musicians being maybe physically visible, which then makes the music to be clearly a separate element rather than integrated into the storytelling. Is that
Or even
accurate?
actors playing.
Right, actors say
The actors playing their own
Yeah.
instruments, which moves it out of naturalism.
Yeah.
Yeah. You got all that?
No.
Other thoughts?
Possibly grittier or kind of darker, more intense themes.
Okay, so themes that are maybe darker or more intense. Yeah. I know a lot of people that I know think of this particular genre as boring or confusing. Other thoughts? Yeah.
Some things that I'm not really familiar with new storytelling per se, but some things that I've seen recently that have been presented as being avant-garde or really new agey or something, just fall into what I think of as black turtleneck, like going back to the beatniks.
Beatniks.
You know, really, and it's like, oh, you know, it's like the homework hasn't been done to think that this is new. This, you know, this isn't new. This is
So-
old. Yeah,
Possibly like trying too hard
maybe.
to be artistic rather than telling a story.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. You got all that?
Yeah.
Sometimes I've heard the word indulgent.
Oh.
Your audience is most likely other artists. I don't think a general public would be likely to attend experimental work.
Okay. So when it's self-referential in terms of the audience,
Yeah, a little bit inside baseball.
inside baseball. Okay.
Bouncing off that, I'm really saying the same thing in a different way, but more concerned about your own intellectual ideas in your piece than about how well you're communicating anything to your viewer. More interested in what you're making than the experience you're giving someone.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's more about the art rather than communication, about personal expression rather than communication.
Right. That could be like a mistake. That isn't necessarily true. People might think that's true.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
Maybe less plot heavy. Maybe
Less plot heavy.
Like
More
songs,
environmental.
song cycles
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Based off of the theme or the vibe
Okay.
of a particular moment.
So then it would be less conventional dramaturgy. Anything else? Yeah.
Maybe that unlike opera and musical theater, the style of music and singing would emerge from the rest of the piece rather than matching like this is musical theater or this is opera. singing.
Okay, so
Like, it
that,
might be folk music, it should be folk music, it might be choral, if that makes sense, you know, it might just shift into whatever. it
so
needs to
the
be.
musical genre, the musical
Yes.
styles might
The
shift
genre
within
is
a
totally
piece.
open, yes.
Whatever the story is required, it'll use that style of music.
Yes.
So a
Exactly.
variety of styles.
Yep.
And we're running out of space here.
No, I'll put it.
Ah, there you go, okay. Okay, so, we can, oh, whoa.
Run away.
Got it.
Let's bring this out too. Slide it
I
down.
tried that, but then it wobbled back. It's
Oh,
okay.
yeah, okay.
My left-handedness.
Oh, my.
There we go. We're fine.
Okay, so, new musical storytelling, for lack of a better, that's just as good as avant-garde or alternative. That's right. Thank you, Jill. So we got dissonant music, perhaps intimate storytelling on the fringe, naturalistic. Music is not centered. Maybe music plays an integral part, an integral role or a different role. Intense, confusing, maybe boring, falling into avant-garde stereotypes. Experimental, self-indulgent, maybe less conventional dramaturgy, not audience-driven, variety of styles.
Musical, yeah.
Musical styles, yeah. Okay, so I asked you, thank you for generating all this stuff, and I asked you to do it as what you think somebody else thinks about it. Now I'm curious to know, any of the stuff that we said, did you think about it? Is that how you think about some of these forms? Two things that I've noticed in the past about this exercise. One is how much of these three genres have in common. Right? So people talk about musicals being cheesy. Well, if you ever really listen to Puccini opera, you can't get much cheesier than that. And expensive and non-naturalistic. A lot of other elements that come into play around musical storytelling. The other thing I've noticed that a lot of these comments, whether they're coming from this is what I think about the art form or this is what I think other people think about the art form, there's an implied value judgment. I like this, I don't like this. And it's one of the challenges for when European operas performed in America is that those of us who have acquired a taste for the classically trained operatic voice forget that it's an acquired taste, and that most Americans have not acquired that taste and will not acquire that taste. They may consider it to be really good singing, but they did, I don't like it. I don't like what it sounds like. But those of us who have acquired a taste for it, like, well, this is fabulous singing. Everybody's going to love this. Well, no, that's not true. I was at a conference a couple months ago, and they were doing something about PR and marketing, and some marketing director said, I just tell people that they love opera, they just don't know it yet. And I just thought, well, that is the most condescending thing possible. I wanted to say, well, you love hip-hop, but you just don't know it yet.
Yeah.
I wanted to tell her that and didn't get a chance to. But in any case, okay, let's erase that and move on. So I want to give you a little bit of background, some thoughts about musical storytelling as to where we are now to wrap up this first section. And this may sound like it's going to get a little dry and academic, and hopefully it won't be. I think the assumptions that we make about opera or about musicals or about alternative work is so much rooted in our experience. And we think, wow, people, if you talk to opera people, they'll say, well, opera was invented in the late 1500s in Italy in the thing called the Camerata. They can talk about all of that. Or you talk to people who are interested in musicals. Well, musicals developed in the late 1800s in America and blah, blah, blah. And things began to shift in theater in the late 1920s as we began to get works like Four Saints and Three Acts or The Mother of Us All, or going into the Bertolt Brecht, Kurt Weill things, into other stuff that was happening on the edges of the mainstream in the middle of the 1900s. And that's when that started. I don't think that's true. That what we're talking about is a form of an art form. You can sit down if you like to, but you don't have to. Sorry. So what we're talking about is this impulse that we have to tell stories. We all know that that's an intrinsic part of our humanity. And we love that. We love to hear stories. Even like you go to, you ever read like, advice columns, it's like, it's a little story, and you follow it, and you're like, oh, I want to see what's going to happen. So the stories are a way of conveying information, of moving out of the reality into something separate that we can then learn from. I'm not a Christian myself, but I understand that Jesus Christ was a great storyteller and always told parables and would make his point by telling a story. Very effective. When those stories are set to music, they become even more engaging. There's something special about stories told through music. The words or images in musical storytelling affect one part of our brain. I won't say size because that's a whole questionable idea about the structure of the brain, but there is a part of our brain that likes to have the concrete image that we can see, the words that we have agreed upon mean certain things. And when those words are put together, they create a story, and that's very concrete, and we understand that. And when it's set to music, something else happens, and the other side of our brain gets engaged in a really interesting and exciting way. And those are less naturalistic, less realistic, less rational, more emotional, more intuitive, less linear, more of an emotional response than a cerebral response. And those two things happen simultaneously, and our brain kind of gets short-circuited and we get high. This is what happens when you go to an opera musical or a new music theater piece. When you have developed a taste for those forms, we actually get a little high. We are transported, we are touched, we are moved, however you want to say it. But something happened, you go, wow. And everybody loves that. Just that's a human impulse. And this is not something that was created in Italy in the late 1500s or in America in the late 1800s. We're talking about an art form that goes back to dancing around the campfire. There was something about that, dancing around the campfire, describing how you were chasing down the bear or whatever it was, and then you draw pictures on the wall of the cave and you have a fire and you dance around and you tell the story. And every culture and every civilization has responded to this impulse of telling stories musically that has to do with their particular culture. So you have ancient Greeks, of course, and that's always thought of as the beginning of things, but that grows out of the cultures and tribes that would dance around the campfire. The Finnish Kalevala, the Balinese shadow puppet theater, the Japanese no theater, African ritual drumming, indigenous American, Native American storytelling, Aboriginal songlines. These are all things that exist in every culture and every civilization that is culturally specific. The impulse to tell stories through music is universal, but the manifestation is culturally specific. When you take a look at that kind of a global view, then you say, oh, what we call opera happens to be Western Europe's response to that impulse. It's no better, no worse than anything else. It's a pretty spectacular form if you develop a taste for it, but it's no more complicated, in fact less complicated than, say, the Indian Kathakali or some of the other musical theater forms that exist in human civilization. And it came about at a time where the country-states of Europe were beginning to coalesce into specific countries, from more of a nationalistic point of view. And then the Western musical system was beginning to develop into a very specific and expressive harmonic system. And out of that grew the story of people saying, let's go back to like the Greeks and the Romans, and we can tell stories through music in this much more expressive way. And this thing developed that we call opera. And then a couple things about that, especially since it came up on our list, is that we tend now to look at European opera and kind of poo-poo it because of its dramaturgy. without even addressing the issue of musical style. It's just saying, oh, those are corny stories. They're not naturalistic. It's not the way people talk nowadays. Well, that's true of Shakespeare's work too. But the main thing is that opera is highly stylized. It's not naturalistic. It's not intended to be naturalistic. It's written in verse for the most part. It makes a clear distinction between the recitative and the musically expansive moments. You can think of them as arias, you can think of them as duets or ensembles or whatever. But then there's other sections of opera that is much more prosaic and talks about this is what we're going to do, and then you think about it. I tend to think of it as the recitative is a character saying, here's the situation I'm in. Then they sing, here's how I feel about it. And it's that emotional expansive moment that's vertical. Story goes along horizontally, things stop and comment on it emotionally. And that's the structure of most conventional European operas. That began to change in the mid-1800s with Verdi and Wagner, and eventually evolved into what we think of as the operatic structure today, which is a prose libretto and through composed. So that's a stylistic shift that happened. But that was, in any case, that was European musical theater. Musical storytelling in Europe was operatic. Okay. When the European settlers came over and took over America, without getting into the horrendous, what they did to the Native Americans, but just saying, this is what happened, they came over here, they brought their musical theater with them. And for a long time, the United States was essentially a European colony, even after the Revolution. There was a sense of that we were basically European, and we were trying to be European, and we're trying to say, oh, we're good, we're sophisticated, because you see, we have opera here too. And so opera was presented as the musical theater of the American culture at the time. This is, we're talking 1700s and 1800s. And the irony is that in Europe at the time, opera was a populist art form. It was not high art. It was a populist art form. If you look at the role that opera played in Italy, say, in the mid-1800s, and we're trying to find a parallel today, you would probably say it's the Broadway musical, or maybe films. If you look at the role that European opera plays in America today, and look at an equivalent in Europe, there isn't any. It's a completely different cultural context. And something happened when it came over to America, and our efforts to be sophisticated, and opera became opera with a capital O, and suddenly became this thing, this evidence that we were sophisticated and cultured. And that's when we got into the ritual and the pageantry, which was present in Europe to a certain extent, but not as much as it was in America. So that became kind of the American thought of as like, well, this is this American/European musical storytelling. There was popular music, there was folk music, but American music didn't start to become into its own until after the Civil War and the freeing of the slaves. And that's when we had the rich culture of the African American musical culture began to influence. We started to get vaudeville, we started to get much more popular music, and we began to develop this thing called musical comedy in the late 1800s. And that lasted going into the 1900s, and musical comedy was a very specific form, much like opera. There were conventions. We had songs that were interchangeable sometimes between shows. The books weren't that important, the story was not that important. But it gave a chance for people to hear these wonderful songs that were being created. And in fact, one of the major artistic achievements of American culture is the so-called Great American Songbook. If you look at that material without any kind of preconceptions about cultural attitudes, there's some incredibly sophisticated writing going on in the Great American Songbook. So in any case, people started to think, as America started to develop its own sense of culture, independent of of Europe, people said, well, you know, obviously what was happening as we got into musical comedy, that eventually became a little more culturally and dramaturgically sophisticated into musical theater, where stories became more important, the songs became more integrated. People were saying, well, that's the American response to this universal musical theater impulse. And there's a lot of self-congratulation about how America was able to do that. So what developed was a sense of a spectrum. If you got opera, and you got musicals. Can people see this? Sorry, is it clear?
Yeah.
Okay, and so that something was either an opera or a musical, and there were some pieces that sometimes were like, well, that's kind of like an operetta, which is like a light opera. It's not quite a musical, although it's kind of like a musical, but it's more like an opera sort of. And there were very few of those. The Most Happy Fellow is oftentimes an example. A couple of other shows like that. Things began to evolve as those two forms began to influence each other. And this is where you get into the question of is Sweeney Todd an opera, whatever it is. So there's argument back and forth, and this was thought of as a spectrum. While all this was happening, two things began to make a major impact on musical storytelling of America. And one was the development of the microphone. And that changed the vocal style of American singers. Whereas in the opera world, before there was any amplification, you had these larger houses, larger meaning 1,000-2,000 seat houses, which later became 4,000 and 5,000 seat houses. Voices were not able to project, so there was a vocal style developed that was about being loud over, being able to be heard over an orchestra, and a particular style of operatic singing that we now think of as opera singing, opera voice, which again is a very specific style. Once amplification came in, then you could, voices, American voices could be, quote, more natural, is the term that's often used. It's not natural at all, but it's more natural. We think of it as more natural. Because singers were able then to be more subtle in their voices, then volume was not an issue because it would be amplified. Frank Sinatra was one of the first to really get into how to use the voice in a way that was much more nuanced. And his recordings, and obviously thought of it as a wonderful vocal performer. So that was one of the things that began to shift a little bit in terms of American musicals. And the other was the development of this third area of alternative music theater that began in the late 20s and 30s of people working on the fringes and the avant-garde, and as it developed through the 50s and 60s. Some of it coming from fear because there were certain opera composers that were saying, you know, we need to take a look at what would be an operatic version of an American version of opera. And somehow they felt like this wasn't quite it. And so that became part of the avant-garde movement. And of course, once you got into performance art, something else began to develop here. So you have this thing that this is now alternative music theater that became its own form, especially in the 60s and 70s going into the 80s. The National Endowment for the Arts was created. There was a section for theater, a section for music, a section for literary arts, for film, for folk arts, for dance. If you were writing an opera, this was back in the late 60s and through the 70s, you had to go to the music program to get funding. If you're writing a musical, you had to go to the theater program to get funding. And after a few years, the opera people were getting upset with the music program because they didn't understand what the opera was about. And the musical theater people were getting upset with the theater program because they didn't understand what musical theater was about. So they actually started talking with each other. So this blending here started to become more and more evident. Meanwhile, the alternative people were just shriveled up because there was no place for them to go. And what happened was that there was a lot of lobbying going on, and eventually the endowment realized that we're talking about a different art form. musical storytelling is not theater that happens to have singing. And musical storytelling is not music that happens to have words. It's a completely different art form. So they actually formed another division, another program, the National Endowment for the Arts, called the Opera-Musical Theater program. They wanted the hyphen, they didn't want to have a slash, because the slash would separate the two. So they actually argued about whether it should be a slash or a hyphen. The opera people didn't want to give up the word opera. Musical theater people didn't want to give up the word musical theater. So that's how it became the OMT program. It was an envelope. I served on the panel I was the chair for the Numerical Works panel for 2 years. And at that point, it became evident that that was the program that these people would start to get funding from. So suddenly people started to take this work seriously. Meredith Monk, Philip Glass, Lee Brewer, a lot of other folks started to realize, like, oh, we're doing something that's kind of like this, but not. It's kind of like this, but it's not. But it's not like this, and it's not like this. So there's just something was beginning to evolve. And then you start to get all the cross-fertilization, and you can say, you look at a piece like, if Sweeney Todd is somewhere in the middle between opera and musicals, for those that need to know, that really want to pin this thing down, then you can say, well, Sunday in the Park with George would never have existed without this world here. Philip Glass writing Up Mountain, or Meredith Monk writing Atlas for the Houston Grand Opera. So there started to be this interaction between these art forms. And what became evident was that this was all part of one whole thing that we call musical storytelling. And for many of us, we realized that the most interesting part of this triangle, of course, was happening in the center. And pieces were being created that drew upon all these influences. And this is not to say that they're all the same. That if I go see La Boheme, I know I'm not watching a musical. If I see Guys and Dolls, I know I'm not watching an opera. But how come? How do we know that? We started to identify there were certain things that, to a certain extent, you can say this is music, and this is words, especially lyrics, and then this tends to be visually oriented. So you can say if you're watching a music theater piece, and music plays a major role, the composer is more important than the writer, the conductor is more important than the director, it's using conventional European vocal style, it's performed by opera companies twice a week, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Chances are you're watching an opera. If you're watching this music theater event, and it's written by a collaborative team that's known as a collaborative team, Rogers, Hammerstein, Cantor, Ed, et cetera. If it uses vernacular musical style, if it's performed on a commercial stage where there's 8 performances a week, prompt at the second act, whatever it is that goes on, then chances are you're watching a musical, especially with the words, and especially lyrics playing an important role. And if you're watching a piece here that seems to have a nonlinear dramaturgy that uses musical style that's drawn from the world music, created collectively or collaboratively. It's performed by art centers or smaller venues rather than an opera house or Broadway. Chances are it's an alternative piece, especially because the visuals become important, not just in terms of the visuals on stage, but how the piece is actually constructed in terms of the nonlinear dramaturgy. Much like a painting, you're responsible for putting together all the parts wherever you look. In the same way, to draw upon that particular process for developing the story. I would argue that musicals are not the American response to the music theater impulses, but rather this combination, because we're dealing essentially with the European influence, dealing with the African American influence, and now we're dealing with the Asian American and Hispanic influence. in terms of the dramaturgy, in terms of the music, and in terms of the words, and in terms of the music here. Thoughts about this? Is this resonating at all with people's experience? I always think my hearing aid just went out at that point. Something. This is making sense at all in terms of your own experience, looking at any of these genres.
I don't know my brain has ever thought about it
What's
like
that?
this, but I don't think my brain has ever thought about it like this, but
Sure.
once you lay it out, I'm like, oh, this does seem like something I'm familiar with.
Yeah. Well, it helps, I think, because what happens is that if you are a fan of musical theater and you go to the opera, and you value the words, you go to the opera, first of all, it's in a foreign language. If it's a contemporary opera in English, it's not written in verse, and so lyrics aren't an issue, right? If you're an opera fan and you go to something like this, you go, what the hell is going on? I don't even understand this piece at all, you know? Or if you're a fan here and you go to musicals, like, well, this is the corniest thing I've ever seen. You know, people are just bursting into songs, you know, or it's you know, it's trash. And I would urge people to rethink that and to understand that these are different genres. These are different genres, all part of one particular art form that I call musical storytelling. And when you start thinking that way, then you realize the lineage of what you're doing as you're creating new work. That you are, as the saying goes, standing on the shoulders of giants. And that people have been exploring the elements of how do words and music come together in order to hit people differently than just words alone. Yeah.
I guess the only thing that occurs to me to add to what you're saying is with the alternative and visually is the whole experience of the abstract expressionists and their influence in the 50s and the and that being uniquely American contribution to the visual arts, that has an impact on.
Absolutely. Well, there's a whole cultural shift that occurred in the middle of the 1900s, from the 1950s until 2000. There's a whole shift in thinking about art, about culture, about politics, about everything. And I think that's one of the things that led to this expansion around the story of musical storytelling. Yeah. Any other thoughts? I'm giving you time here. Okay, very good. So a couple of other comments. Nowadays, the question that people are asking is Hamilton an opera, right? And I think Hamilton begins to fall into this area here. Because if you study the score, it's quite operatic in terms of how it uses music. The lyrics are obviously growing out of the Broadway musical tradition. It's not a rap opera, it's a musical theater. It's a Broadway musical, but it uses words in a way and music that resonates with hip hop culture in a strong way. And the storytelling is not necessarily completely linear. And dance plays such a much role. The production of Hamilton is so visually stunning in terms of how they use dance. So it starts to move here. Talk about pieces like Hadestown or The Great Comet of 1812, and other pieces that are Strange Loop, pieces that are commercially on Broadway. It's just the tip of the iceberg of what's happening in terms of people writing what they might think of as musical theater, but really it's new American musical storytelling. That's happening not on Broadway, but happening elsewhere around the country. And that artists are working in this art form. Whether or not it ever lands on Broadway is irrelevant because that may not be their particular intention. So in that sense, it's an incredibly exciting time right now to be exploring this thing because we're headed towards something. We're not quite there yet, but we're headed towards something. You look at the influence of the theater folks like Robert Wilson, who just passed away a couple weeks ago, and even Bertolt Brecht, the work that he did with looking at Asian theater and how they developed into a different kind of storytelling that is not naturalistic and says, you know, people say, oh, musical theater is not naturalistic, and those of us involved in the art form say, yeah, that's the strength of it. Because in most operas and most musicals, The characters hardly sing at all. The performers sing all the time, but the characters aren't singing if you attach a naturalistic storytelling to it. People don't talk like they talk in musicals or operas, because it's not trying to do that. That's why oftentimes I'll say, well, acting has no place on the opera stage. Because acting, in our culture, acting tends to be as naturalistic as you can possibly make it. And naturalism doesn't belong in musical storytelling. It's intended to be stylized, it's intended to be non-naturalistic, and then requires the audience to make them want to take a step further into the piece. We did a production of The Fantastics maybe 9 years ago, and which is a classic off-Broadway musical. And the Young Lovers were performed by two performers in town here. One was, she was 72 and he was 65. And her first line in the piece is, "I'm 16 years old." So here's a 72-year-old woman saying, I'm 16 years old. And the audience was like, oh, okay. And they're going to tell the story. And we simply accept that this is the case. The two fathers bemoaning the fact that their children are having difficulty, are dealing with their emotional reality. It was played by two women. They weren't mothers, they played them as fathers. And that required the audience to get involved in the piece in a really different way than it just happening in front of them with two fathers and this 16-year-old and a 20-year-old. Thoughts about any of that? Sometimes in an opera, the character sings. If there's a lullaby or drinking song or some other, Carmen sings the song, and that's when the character is singing. But the rest of the time, the character is not singing. The performer is explaining to you in the way of a monologue. This is what, if you could see what the character is feeling, this is what it would sound like, this is what it would look like. So when you start to look at it that way, you say, this is the most weirdest art form ever. This is a form of theater that's easily dismissed as boring opera or cheesy musicals or confusing alternative music theater. And I think not. I think it's more expansive than most people will give it credit for. But it does require you to get involved in it and see it and hear it in a different way. Other comments?
I'm thinking about this idea of willing suspension of disbelief and like how we cultivate that in people who do not have a taste, as you're saying, for theater or musical theater. But there is a willingness to suspend disbelief for, something like a Marvel movie, which I don't personally have a taste for, so I don't go see them.
Uh-huh.
And then I'm kind of wondering, when we're bringing audiences in, how do we balance the pushing people past the discomfort of saying, I don't really want to see this because it's not my taste, this is not what I want to do, versus saying, but this is our natural impulse to tell and listen to stories, and so this could be for you. Not really a question.
No, I think it's a good point. Two responses. One is that people may say, oh, I don't like musicals, I don't like musical storytelling. I'm a Taylor Swift fan. I'm a Bruce Springsteen fan. Like, oh, that's what they're doing. Do you understand that? Do you understand that we are rooted in musical storytelling? That popular music is all about that. It's about words and music coming together. People talk about music nowadays. They're always talking about songs, for the most part, in terms of the larger popular culture. And yes, there's people who listen to classical music, people who listen to jazz, instrumental stuff. That's great. But we're talking about something different. We're talking about musical storytelling. So I think people do have that impulse. They haven't developed a taste around a particular style. And as people start to understand that, then two things will happen. People will expand their tastes, and also creators will start to speak the language of the audience. The vernacular music is the music of our time. At some point there will no longer be a question of whether rock and roll can be on Broadway. I mean, already that's happening. I mean, I'm talking about true rock and roll, not just pop music. But the other thing is that there's a wonderful book called Art and Fear, and it talks about artists and how they grapple with the creative process. And it's written by two artists, and one of them tells the story of when he's playing with one of his children, who's like 4 or 5 or something. And he teaches at a local college, and at one point he's done, he says, well, I have to stop playing now because I have to go to work. And the child says, what do you do at work? And he says, well, I teach people how to draw. And the little child says, oh, you mean they forget? So when a parent reads a bedtime story to a child, the parent doesn't say, now, before I read this to you, I want you to explore your suspension of disbelief, because I'm going to be telling you a story about a bear, the 3 bears and Goldilocks and so forth. And when I say the bear's voice, I'm not going to become the bear. I just want, they don't do that. The parent just reads the story, and the child just says, oh, okay, I'm hearing the story, and my mom's telling me the story. I don't think she's a bear, but when she makes that voice, I can think about her being a bear, or I can think about her bareness, or whatever, and suddenly the child is like, yeah, okay, I accept that, And so then what happens? We forget. We get so rooted in naturalism as the primary form of storytelling, primarily through films and through most conventional American plays. And yet, if Bertolt Brecht came back today and he saw an episode of The Office, he'd be like, yeah, that's the way the story should be told. But I think we're able to accept that more than we give audiences credit for. And then the question is, what's the barrier? And oftentimes it is stylistic. Either they don't like the sound of an operatic voice, or they don't like the sound of a Broadway voice, or they have been led to believe that alternative music theater doesn't speak to them. Yeah.
I was gonna say though, I don't know if anybody else agrees. I feel like if you just took like the average United States American, like just a person in the United States, they are much more likely to see a musical than a play. No, I mean, if a theater's putting on musical than plays, everyone's coming to Hamilton. No one is coming to Proof. That's just how it is. So interestingly, while there is that huge suspension of disbelief, I think actually the average person, maybe because of what you were saying before about what it does to our brains, they're more likely to get dressed up, get their dinner, go to the musical. Yeah. Maybe, sadly, only once a year. We want them to be coming more, but I feel like it pulls people in.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think, where do people get most of their musical theater fix through their life? Because of high school. You get high school musicals. I mean, that is the whole culture that establishes early on that there's a thrill to either being in or watching a musical.
Well, I use a sports analogy a lot to tell people, but like when I was growing up, there was no professional soccer. And today, the Seattle Sounders are selling as many tickets per game as the Minnesota Vikings, and they do it 3 times more a year. And if you survey the Seattle Sounders audience, 95% of them played soccer at one point in their life. So 95% played soccer at some point in their life. So if you understand that, you understand that for the MLS to exist today, youth soccer programs in the 1970s needed to get started all across America. And I think that's certainly true with musical theater, and I think a foundation has been laid with the prevalence of musical theater in American high schools today.
In the 80s, there was a major push to develop a Little League version of musical theater, in terms of how Little League was turned people into sports fans, and exactly the same thing, trying to do that in the arts education field, of course, and then cuts came into arts or schools, and there you go. We have a little bit of time left. I just want to move on to the other 2 elements real quick, if that's okay. If there's anything else that needs to be said about any of this. Okay, so just want to share a couple things that I've been working with composers and writers for 40 years now, and we developed this thing that Jill and I are doing in a couple months, this Composer Writer Studio. And out of that...
Can you repeat that? What is it?
The Composer Librettist Studio.
The Composer Librettist Studio.
Right. And there's cards and things out. Well, in fact, I have some cards here we can pass out at the end. And just to be clear, just as a sort of a general rule, a composer writes the music for a musical. The lyricist writes the words. A book writer writes the dialogue and the shape of the overall story. Oftentimes, conventionally, those are the three roles. In the opera world, in the traditional opera world, there was a composer and a librettist. A librettist is a writer who writes both the lyrics and the book. Because back in the day, the whole book was versified, and so therefore there was a certain skill of being able to versify and write the words in a structural way that made sense for the music. So that's the distinction that's oftentimes lost. Oscar Hammerstein was a librettist. He wrote the book and the lyrics for all the great Oscar Hammerstein musicals. Stephen Sondheim was not a librettist. He was a lyricist and a composer. And it's more, sometimes somebody will try to do all three. In a very small percentage of times that works. But there are different sensibilities, different orientations toward telling stories. And it's more likely that a composer might also be a lyricist, but very rarely is a composer also a book writer. And that's why Sondheim made it very clear that he could not write a book. He had to work with the book writers. But he wrote his own lyrics because of the musicality of lyrics writing. So in any case, in the Composer Libretto Studios, one of the things that has evolved, when I started the program back in 1984, I didn't know anything. And so I was like, let's put these composers and writers together and you guys can collaborate. And you know, hilarity ensued, and a lot of other things ensued. But in any case, I started to get more specific about certain principles. And so I'm going to quickly go through it because this connects to the kind of work that happens in ensemble creation. And there is a continuum, and people do get confused about this. There is such a thing as collaborative creativity, and there's such a thing as collective creativity. And those are two different points on a spectrum, and it is a spectrum back and forth. It's not clear cut, but oftentimes there's confusion about the two. And I think the primary distinction is that in collaborative creativity, there's a clarity around the roles that people are going to play in the collaborative process. That based on their skills, based on their orientation, based on what they're capable of doing. And what they're not capable of doing is what their collaborator can do. Whereas in collective creativity, there's a sense of we're doing this together, and we're all going to do all the parts of it. And there is less of a distinction between the various skills. Again, that's the extreme. And with these two extremes, there's a much more fluid reality of what happens. Especially if you can identify your collaborators as your first audience, in a sense. And so somebody may not have a skill in a particular area, but they may have a sensibility and a sense of the collective vision of the piece to be able to comment on or to offer suggestions or even make decisions. Working with that distinction, a couple of principles, 7 collaborative principles that we work with in our studio and with the work that we do at Nautilus, and frankly, with the work that everybody does in working collaboration. All I've done is to write down some of these things, so I didn't invent these at all. But the first one is to develop trust and respect, and that seems really obvious, but many people don't know what that means. What does it mean to trust somebody? Are you able to agree on a particular assignment, say, if you're working collaboratively, and waiting for them to do their work? Do they do it on time? Do they do what they say they do? Do you do what you say you'll do? How does it feel to be trusted, and how does it feel to trust somebody? And what happens when that trust is violated, and do you have ways to deal with that in terms of accountability? And respect to work, sometimes I've seen instances where it turns out that a collaboration gets started and lo and behold, one of the collaborators doesn't respect the work of the other. And it may not be that you like it or dislike it, that's different than respecting it. So how do those elements fit into establishing a creative, the basis of a collaborative relationship? Another principle is coming to a common understanding of the challenge. So often I've seen collaborative difficulties occur because the collaborators are each trying to solve a different problem. They haven't agreed upon what the problem is or what the challenge is, what they're trying to do. And so they come up with solutions proposed to each other, but the solutions don't work because they're not solving the same problem. So how much discussion can occur ahead of time to say, what are we trying to do here? Are we clear on what this is? Another collaborative principle is creating a shared space. This is about being able to physicalize or visualize or in some way demonstrate in a hands-on, real way what it is that you're talking about. I may have an idea in my mind. I try to articulate that idea. You hear my articulation, and based on what you've heard, you construct in your mind what you think I'm saying. And the picture in your mind may be totally different from the picture in my mind. And then we're arguing about something that we don't have in common. If you can somehow stand side by side and look at something. Here's an example of what I mean. I'm thinking of a melody that sounds something like this, or I'm thinking that dramaturgically there needs to be this structure or this kind of language or whatever it is. Or working in performance and rehearsal. If I suggest to a performer, hey, what if you were to do such and such? And the performer says, well, my character wouldn't do that. And I would say, yeah, they would, no, they wouldn't, yeah, they would, no, they wouldn't. Well, we get nowhere. But if the performer says, well, I'll try that, and they try it, and then they can say, oh, that worked better than I thought it would. Or I might say, yeah, that was a stupid idea of mine. Never mind. But at least you've got something that you can respond to, something real world, rather than an exchange of words that create conversational ambiguity. And that's one of the things that can really get in the way of collaboration. Being clear about your intention, roles, and agendas. This is about making it clear who's going to be doing what in our group, and what are you responsible for, what am I responsible for, what do I get to do, what do you get to do. Sometimes working with people or composers who come from a classical music background, there are assumptions like, well, of course I can change the words if the words aren't working for me. And playwrights are like, excuse me? No, you can't do that. Well, they clearly haven't talked about who's responsible for what and what sort of adjustments are either able to make. And that's something that, again, the more you can discuss this ahead of time, the more you increase the chance of collaborative success. Expanding your capacity for making decisions is another one. Have you figured out how you're going to make decisions? And is there going to be a voting situation if it's a group, or are you going to be involved in assigning decision making? You get to decide about this, I get to decide about that. Or, everybody speaks about consensus, making decisions by consensus, which is really misunderstood. That oftentimes people say, well, consensus is that we discuss it and we all agree that this is the best solution. And that's not what consensus is, because that very rarely happens. And consensus is that we all discussed it and we all agreed that this was a decision that we could all live with. This decision works for all of us. I think of it as, well, this is being discussed, it's on the table, this is what's being discussed, and yeah, I could live with that. If it were up to me, if I had to make the decision by myself, I would pick this, because I think this is the best decision. But this would sort of work. At least we're not going to consider this, because this would not work. And I could not live with this, but I can live with this. And I can open-heartedly embrace this decision and not undermine it afterwards. I don't get to say, yeah, we decided it was, I didn't think it was the best idea, but we just, it was getting late, we all had to cave in or whatever. So that's something that, the issue of compromise is really misunderstood. And compromise is a way of getting something that's important to you. And compromise has become the notion of losing something that's important to you. And there was a time, some of you may not remember this, but there was a long time ago where to call somebody a good politician was a compliment. Because politics is the art of compromise. A politician is somebody who can take competing points of view and creatively come up with a solution that gives each side some of what's most important to them. And now it's become something very different. It requires that you need to know what's important to you. You need to be clear about your values and what you're not willing to give up on, and what you're willing to let go of. I would really like this, but I have to have this. And that's the way that you begin to negotiate something that you get what's really important to you, knowing that your partner is going to lose something that's less important to them, but they're going to get something that's important to them too. And this is where raw creativity comes into play, when you begin to explore compromises. Generating and manipulating models. Good collaborators are those who are able to take a look at something. This isn't quite working, but there's something there. Let's manipulate it. Let's work with it. Let's change it. Let's do iterations on it. If it's not working, throw it out. Come up with something new. Kind of raw creativity is a really important element in collaborative work. And lastly, being open to outside resources and strategies. This is the notion that we've got something here, let's test it out, see what people think, get some feedback. They're not going to be involved in the decision-making process, but they're going to give us some information that we can then use to revise your piece if we need to. And intrinsic in that is the notion that I or we can't do everything ourselves. So hence we're going to collaborate, and hence we're going to ask for a perspective from somebody who's not inherently in the decision-making process. So those are 7 collaborative principles that we explore in the studio. And the main takeaway, I think, for the collaboration is that good collaborators are really skilled in dominating and accommodating compromise, and sometimes resigning. That dominating or leading is not a bad thing. Accommodating or following is not a bad thing. Compromise or blending is not a bad thing. These are tools and strategies that good collaborators can use. And it becomes this elegant dance. I used to refer to, if you've ever seen Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers dance. Now, people don't know what I'm talking about. You go on YouTube, you can check it out. And there's just this wonderful flow between the two of them. And that's the way collaboration works best. Thoughts about any of this? This is very quick, just a gloss over, but anything strike you, anything resonates, any of this? Jill, anything you want to add to this?
Seems like it should be the first thought, but I was really hit by when you said try the articulated suggestions, so you have something physical to reference.
Yeah, we're creating a shared space. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, whether, it might be a yellow pad, it might be a score, it might be an actual physical staging. It could even be a telephone conversation if the words that you're using are very careful, especially if you're dealing with words as the topic under consideration. Yeah.
I think I just love how you put a frame around the idea of coming to a shared understanding of the challenge. When you said that, I thought, oh yes, so many conversations I've been in that weren't even tense, but they were just kind of taking longer than they needed to, or going around in circles. I'm realizing now, I think the issue was no one paused to say, what are we trying to solve right now? What is the goal? What are we actually talking about right now? And that just kind of gives this focus that means we're all like a magnet, or like a North Star that we're all then like magnetizing around and toward like one compass needle instead of like we're all going off in different directions.
Yeah, that does happen.
Really helpful.
I was brought in once as a dramaturgical consultant for a team that was having difficulty, and they both had actually done the studio with me years earlier in New York, and as we began to explore what the issue were, it turns out that the composer was writing a large-scale musical theater piece that would pay enough in royalties over the years to send her kids to college. And the writer was writing an intimate piece that would be done by regional theater companies across the country. Right. And they never talked about that in terms of their intention and what their agenda was. So every time the composer would suggest something, the writer would think, well, that's got nothing to do with what we're trying to do here. And anytime the writer would suggest something, the composer would say, well, that's got nothing to do with what we're trying to do here, because they weren't on the same page about what they were trying to do here. And ultimately, the collaboration fell apart. Other thoughts about any of this?
I really appreciate the idea of dominating, accommodating, and compromising, being able to have all three skills. I think so frequently, especially as a young woman, I am afraid of the dominating part because I don't want people to see me as bossy or a bitch. But I like that is a skill of mine, is leading, and sometimes I know I'm good at accommodating and I know I'm good at compromising, but sometimes I just have to be able to say like, nope, I'm taking none of us are on the same page about this, and we all need to get clear about what we're talking about.
And that's a different reason to take a lead.
Yeah.
Because sometimes we take leads. It may even be the instance as you described in terms of social conditioning. I don't care that much about this issue, but I'm gonna dominate on it because I need to practice dominating. I don't do that very well, so I'm going to practice dominating. And just for this one issue. And then you can sort of see how that affects the collaborative process. And sometimes that's the healthiest thing to do. Or there may be people who say, I need to practice accommodating. I need to follow more because my collaborators are more likely my ex-collaborators consider me to be too much of a dominator. Or whatever it might be. Yeah. Anything else? But then lastly, just for those of you that might be interested, and this is a little flyer we have for this the Composer Better Studio. Pass these around, I guess. And this is a program that we've done. I think this is the 71st time I've done the studio. Working with composers, writers, and performers, a very intensive 2.5 weeks. Dealing with collaboration, especially as a strategy for making new music theater, as well as exploring different genres of music theater and exploring the interaction with the performers. We're in the process of setting it up now for November. Jill and I will be doing this project together. And so there's information there about the studio. It might be of interest to you, even if you're not going to apply, but just know that some of us are trying to deal with some of these issues around this moment in our cultural history of developing this thing called American musical storytelling, which is it's not opera, it's not musicals, it's something else. It draws upon those lineages and the legacy of those art forms, which I happen to be quite enamored of. But I also recognize that even better than traditional opera or conventional Broadway musicals. The other night I went to see Singing in the Rain. A couple of folks asked me to go singing, and it was great. It was just a lot of fun, and it was nice to see something done in an honorable way with the right intention and a lot of integrity. And I could look at that and say, now that's a Broadway musical. And look at those tap dancers, wow. You know. And it was great, and I can enjoy that, you know, and if I can go see, La Boheme or Othello or the Ring Cycle or whatever it is, and I can enjoy that too. Because there's just something about when words and music come together, and I just love what it does to me. Any other last minute comments as we wrap things up? Any questions about stuff that we do? Yeah.
Yeah, going back to the diagram here, what's a piece that you would kind of put on the spectrum in between the alternative works and the European opera works?
Oh, I think a lot of the later Philip Glass works that he's
Gotcha.
done for opera companies that use operatic singers. Einstein on the Beach was more of an alternative music theater piece, but his later stuff like Akhenaten and Satyagraha and all the works from that point on, written for opera singers, usually for opera houses. Meredith Monk's Atlas was a piece that Houston Grand Opera did, and I was involved in setting her up with that. And that's a piece that there's a storyline there, but it's done in a nonlinear way, and primarily visually. Very, very little text in that. That's one of the things that has happened in terms of America, or in terms of humanity. If you accept the artificial split of the East versus the West, it's interesting how the cultures in the West generally have put together words and music, musical storytelling, but cultures in the East have put together images and music to tell stories to music. And that's one of the reasons why this area here is being influenced by Asian cultures and Hispanic cultures as we're looking at things differently. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you.
Other questions? Anything about Nautilus, how we work, or what it's all about? We also work with singer-actors, and we have a summer training institute for singer-actors and explore the breadth of musical storytelling and how the voice, the face, and the body work together, or sometimes against each other in order to tell the story. Okay, I think we're done here then, I guess.
Thank you.